Hello and welcome back to the third video in our series on introducing object-oriented programming to people who already know a bit of Java programming. And so in the previous videos you learned the key distinction between a class, the blueprint, and an object, the specific instances that are coming from that particular blueprint. And then you also learned the keyword static, and everything that everything you created as a beginner program was always static. Your main method was static. Any helper methods you created were static. But now you understand that when you get into looking at blueprints, you actually move away from that static. And what you're doing is creating variables that have meaning to the particular instances that are created. Each instance of a class, each object, will have a unique set of information, data reserved just for that object, and it will have methods that, because they aren't static, are able to manipulate that information. The key takeaway from that is that when you have methods now that aren't static, you cannot just call them the way you used to. You have to attach it to an instance. And I'll give you a really quick example. If you have a public class called card, and you've got a single public variable called suit, you can see both sides are the same, and you have a method called drawCard. Now none of these are static, which means that they have to be associated with an instance. In the main method of this no side, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to call drawCard directly. And that used to work. But now, because it's not static, it has no meaning. It can't call a method that could potentially access instance variables when you don't have an instance or an object to call it from. So this cannot be done. You also can't access the suit because you're in a method that has nothing to do with the class. It's static, and so it can't directly access information like suit or methods like drawCard. The only way to do that, as you can see on the right side, the only way to do that is to access it through an instance. These variables and these methods only have meaning when attached to a particular instance. I can set the suit for this particular card, and I can also set it for a different card, but I can't just call it for no card in particular. Same thing with this method drawCard, is that I'm going to draw the card from a particular one, a particular instance. So the question that sort of comes up is, well, how do I create these instances? What are the rules for how to create an instance of a card, or an instance of a string, or an instance of a robot? And even though you've done a few examples in object-oriented programming, we've never really talked about how these are constructed. What you've done, what you've used, is what's called the default constructor, which you didn't see and you didn't know about. Today you're going to learn a little bit about how you can take control over the way that these classes are instantiated into objects. You as the programmer can control how that construction happens. And you do it through methods. And it's a special kind of method. And it's actually called a constructor, which kind of makes sense because its sole job is to construct an object from a class. And so I'll give you an example, and I'm going to show you how there's a particular format to these methods. And if you follow them, it just works. It gets called automatically. You don't need to call it. Everything works great. So this is an example of a constructor. You can see that it has the keyword public. Kind of makes sense that a constructor would have to be public because everybody needs to know how to create, right? Anyone using that class has to be able to create it. Now comes some of the differences from the methods that you know. First of all, there is no return type. And the reason there is no return type for a constructor is because it's literally returning or constructing an instance of that object. So it doesn't make sense to say this returns void or this returns int. It is returning an instance of the card class in this case. So there is no return there. Then the name of the method, and this is part of what makes it a constructor, is that the name of the method matches exactly the name of the class. So that when you say card C equals new card, it is going to look for that method. Then you have your parameters. And the parameters are the things that you want people to provide in order to create that information. So in this case, I haven't provided any parameters. It would be called the default constructor. So when nobody provides information on how to create a card, it will go to this method and it will do whatever you want it to do by default. Maybe set the suit to 1 or the rank to 2, or the suit to 1 and the rank to 1. You decide what that sort of default behavior is. You could also create a constructor, and you can create as many of these as you want, but I could also create a constructor where the suit and the rank are provided. In that case, what the constructor is going to do is take the suit associated with this class and assign it the value of what's being given to it. And the same thing with the rank. It takes the rank from this class, the object it's about to create, and assigns it the value of what's given over there. And so now I'm able to create a card, and I'm able to create a new card, and I'm able to give it those two numbers. And when it creates a card, and that's what this new thing is doing, is it's creating that instance. It is going to try to match a method to what's provided in here. And if it can't find one, it will spit out an error because it cannot find a match. It cannot construct an object with the information that you've provided. So we're going to jump to NetBeans for a second so I can give you a bit more of a concrete example. So we're back in NetBeans, and you can see I've created a class to represent a house. And you'll also notice that I have a few pieces of information just to make it a little bit more clear. We'll specifically define these as public. And you'll also notice that I have created one static variable, and that is going to be just the model name. And that model name is going to follow for every single house. It's going to be a shared piece of information. That probably doesn't make sense, but just so that you can see that difference, we've highlighted it. Now you have to think to yourself, well, what are the important ways that I might want to create a house? And so if you remember the formula, if I want to create a constructor, I have to specifically write that constructor in the format of public, class name, parameters, and then fill it in. And so I'm just going to quickly toss in the main method. So bear with me. So here's my main method. And right now, having not created a constructor, the only way that I can create a house is by using the default constructor, which is always there. And by default, as you can imagine, it's not actually going to set up any of these variables with meaningful values. But I can still create that house if I want to. And it will gladly do so. And if I wanted, I can then access those instance variables, and I could set them to whatever values I want. But what if we want to create a house in different ways? What if when I create a house I want to be able to provide the colors, or if I wanted to be able to say whether the model is flipped left, the garage on the left, garage on the right. So I can certainly do it after the fact, after I create it. But when you're making a design like this, you usually want to make the design a little bit robust. So you want to think of what ways the house is most likely going to be created. And that's where you create your constructors. So the formula we talked about, public, no return type, house, and then you think about the information that you want to pass in. So maybe I'll do brick color. Oh, these are color variables. And color, door color. And so when I do this, when I'm creating my own constructor, you need to decide what happens to those parameters, to the arguments that are coming in, those values, what you're going to do with them. So I have to say specifically that I want brick color to be given this value, and I want door color, would help if I typed properly, equal to that one. And now I've created one constructor. Oh, but wait, you're saying to yourself, why did this all of a sudden give me an error when it wasn't giving one before? Well, when you don't have any constructors defined, it always is going to use that default behavior. But once you as the programmer say, here's a constructor that I've created, then Java will no longer use that default constructor because you might not want that default constructor to be used. So once you have created one constructor, if you still want that other behavior to take place, then you need to also create that default constructor and decide what you want to be done with it. So maybe by default I want the flip to be true, and well, let's leave that alone. And then maybe I want these other ones given some default value, so I could fill that in there as well. And now you'll see that this is happy, and now you'll see that there are now two ways that I could potentially create a house. I could create a different house now, and I could give it different values. So black for the brick color, and maybe, well, sure, we'll go with cyan, why not? And so now I have created two houses, and I've constructed them in two different ways using the information that I have provided to it. So if you've been following along in these videos, then you should have been constructing a square class of your own. And each one is going to look a little bit different. But what I want you to do now is to go back to that square class and create a couple constructors. Perhaps one that is sort of the default with no parameters, and maybe one that contains the parameters necessary to create that square with specific values. You can create more than two if you want, but go ahead and create two, and then make sure that you can use those constructors in order to be able to do something useful, in your main method. As usual, if you have any difficulties, feel free to leave me a comment or an email, or use my chat. Take care. Hope this was helpful.